continued drive on EBI, improved herd maturity, improved herd fertility, extra grass grown in the system will have to be through clover really, cutting the concentrate levels that's been fed while also improving herd productivity and keeping control of costs. It's a long list, but the point is if we do those things, we're giving ourselves the best possible chance to survive the lower base price years. The other thing is all of those things will really benefit you when the base price is higher than what's quoted in the roadmap. We get it, we take it, the target is ambitious, but it's not about the final figure on that. It's more about the indicative target of where those things are trying to bring you towards rather than saying everybody's going to be there by 2030.
I'm joined this week by Emer Kennedy, Dairy Enterprise Leader in Teagasc Moorepark, and also Joe Patton, Head of Dairy Knowledge Transfer. Emer and Joe join me to discuss the recently launched Teagasc Dairy Roadmap 2030, a blueprint for where the Irish dairy sector needs to go over the remainder of this decade. It sets out clear KPIs across profitability, sustainability, breeding, labour and environmental performance. I started by asking Emer the core purpose of the Dairy Roadmap.
So James, the new dairy roadmap has been launched, and I guess it puts a stake in the ground as to where we are at present, but it also provides a clear and evidence-based pathway for the Irish dairy sector to grow sustainably over the coming years and get us to 2030. So in short, it's key targets for farmers to follow that'll balance their production, their profit and their environmental sustainability.
And I mentioned it there, I suppose. It's not the first of these roadmaps, Emer. If we maybe look back, and I had to look back to, there was a Dairy Roadmap 2020, I suppose, what were some of the main targets in that, and did the sector achieve them over that period of time?
I think that's one of the really important things, James, is even to look back and just see how far we come, because it's been quite positive, the improvements that have been made by the sector and the industry as a whole over the last number of years. So for example, if we look at milk output in 2025, that was approximately 8.9 billion litres, and that represents a 10% increase on 2020. Milk solids, that's also increased by 6% per cow since 2020, and also 6-week calving rate has increased by 5%. If we look at some of the other metrics, like average number of lactations per cow now stands at 4.7, while it was only 3.4 in 2020. And again, fertilizer usage has reduced from 184 kilos of nitrogen per hectare in 2020 to 150 kilos of nitrogen per hectare in 2024. So as we can see, there's been lots of progress since 2020, but equally, I guess there are a lot of areas where there's still room for improvement over the coming years.
And Joe, maybe to bring you in on that, because I think our farmer listeners, a lot of them could maybe actually look at this dairy roadmap and looking at some of the KPIs within it and go, well, will I ever get there type of thing. It's important to look back and to acknowledge the progress that has been made, or would you maybe just comment on that?
It is, James, and to remember too, that's the 2020 figures Emer was talking about there. You go back to 2015 even, and that was a watershed time in the Irish industry, obviously. And again, you see from there, at that stage, we were probably sitting closer to sort of 360 kilos of solids, and protein was under 3.4, and calving interval was over 400 days at that stage. And I suppose, to be fair to them type of metrics, they're slow. It's slow. It seems like slow progress when you're in the middle of it because it's happening every day. But it's actually quite rapid progress, really, when you think about what has changed in 10 years. The level of performance and the average level of performance has really cranked up. And what we also see, obviously, driving that is there's also a group at the upper end of performance within the sector. There's always a range within year. I suppose the rising tide has lifted all boats, but when you see the technologies being implemented now at the upper end of efficiency, like there's some really, really efficient herds out there that have really got to the point of implementing technologies across multiple areas: breeding, animal health, fertilizer, cash management, milk quality. They're hitting the marks on all those things. And I suppose really, when just to make the point, like where I think the roadmap is useful, as much as it is arguing plus or minus €5 or plus or minus 10 kilos or whatever it might be on any of the metrics, I think what the roadmap really does is it gives people an idea of not only the targets they're trying to hit, but actually which are the things that need to be focused on the most. Like It's quite simple. It's broken down into sort of 4 key areas, and when you look at those areas, if you went down through each of those and looked at your own situation relative to them as a snapshot of what's possible, I think it's a really useful guide in that regard. So not only does it tell you what the target is, but it also says what are the things we need to be really focused on. I think that's nearly even more important point. One of the big advantages I think that farmers in this country have is the access to the data for their own situation, James. So you go through the numbers there. If you take pasture base, for example, for your grass production stuff, profit monitor for your and NFS, but particularly for an individual farm, profit monitor, let's say for your profitability stuff, AgNav for your sustainability measures, and then Herd Plus through ICBF for your breeding measures, and obviously your co-op data as well. There's no end to the data for dairy farmers in Ireland now at this point, and I suppose in a way that this helps to sort of bring people back to picking out the things that are most important. And I think it's easy to forget that. Look at all the data we have available to us, and then bringing that back into the few key measures. Really, really, really important.
Yeah, and it's probably one of the few documents that probably
Together, yeah,
data
true.
together. Come here, I want to maybe go through and dig into some of these different areas within the document, and our listeners will be fit to access the document and have a look at it. I'm not going to touch on them all, but maybe I'm going to come to yourself first, Joe, with regards that kind of farm system and sustainability piece. Net margin, and I see it's based off a base price of 35 cents a litre, and the targets are outlined. Can you maybe explain these targets and how these targets can be achieved at what the reality is people would perceive as a relatively low base price, Joe?
Well, it is a relatively low base price, James, and it's not to say that that's a prediction on milk price in any way. As you know, the market is so changeable now that predicting forward on milk price is not what we're trying to do here. But I suppose what this is trying to do is to take a situation to say that the type of system we're talking about, is it robust and protected at in years where there will be a low base milk price, and then obviously the same system should return much higher than that. As base price increases, or within years. So the idea is, I suppose, for the type of system we're talking about here, there's no point in having something and the targets in place for a system that only works if the market is for us. We need something that'll keep us, keep the lights on when the market price is against us, that we can prosper then maybe when the thing changes. So, the base price of 35 cents, that's at a base price with your standard sort of industry standard at 3.6, 3.3. So one of the big things I suppose here is that solids increases over time, right? So as solids percentages increase over time, um, the gap between the average price received and the base price quoted will get bigger, if you know what I'm saying. So if
And
you go
that
back,
really has been seen, Joe, over the last couple
and
of seasons.
and
The
that's
differential has become much
absolutely
greater. Like,
absolutely critical. So you go back to 2015, for example, right? You're at 390 fat and 336 protein. So if you were quoting 35 cent a litre base price at that stage, the received price on average would have been about 35.5 cent. Now we're quoting 35 cent. The received price could be significantly higher than that. Okay. So what we need is then to get that point out there that the gap between the quoted and the actual price gets larger as we improve the solids over time. So you'd be hoping as you move towards an average of 3.7 protein and maybe 450 fat, something of that magnitude, the 35 cent, we're leaving the 35 cent a litre base price behind us a little bit. That combined with you'd be assuming a relatively positive position for beef price over that period of time as well, which is adding to your gross output. But also the capacity then, maybe as farms have matured and are settled into a settled system, that the cost of expansion might have begin to wash out of the system. Obviously, costs like labor and that will have increased, so there is scope maybe in terms of cost cutting there. So
Emer alluded to one there,
yeah,
though, Joe, which is probably that average lactations, and
Yeah,
that's gonna have a fair bearing as we move forward. Just looking at the national herd stats,
sure.
they've kind of settled down. So, like, our
So
farmers going to kind of reap that benefit now as we move forward in terms of overall farm production.
you would be thinking so, James. So you would have maybe a lower replacement cost, a higher opportunity for extra, dairy beef calf sales,
Mm.
increase in milk solids content to drive your base price, maybe better animal health, so better output through reduced cell count, for example, fertility improving as well, 6 week calving rate improving, which will help to drive your output as well indirectly. Um, lameness rates and things like that coming back, so that there's a more productive herd for more days in the year. And I get the point, James. Sounds like wishful thinking in a way that all these things are going to happen together. But I suppose the point is, if you bring all those things together, this is just an indication of where that could bring you, rather than saying that everybody in the industry is going to get there. If you know, it is a target and a roadmap after all. So
Yeah.
while what's down on paper is quite of a stretch target, there's no point in saying otherwise. Um, it's really is contingent on all of the things we're after listing out there. Continued drive on EBI, improved herd maturity, improved herd fertility, extra grass grown in the system through will have to be through clover, really cutting the concentrate levels that's been fed while also improving herd productivity,
Mm.
and keeping control of costs. That's a long list, James, right? It's a long list. And look, but the point is, if we do those things, we're giving ourselves the best possible chance to survive the lower base price years. But the other thing is that all of those things will really benefit you when the base price is higher than what's quoted in the roadmap. So we get it, we take it. The target is ambitious, but it's not about the final figure on that. It's more about the indicative target of where those things are trying to bring you towards, rather than saying everybody's going to be there by 2030.
When you look back over previous roadmaps and current performance, is there any one thing that doesn't align with previous targets?
I suppose the one area, James, where we'd be saying that we've struggled over the last number of years is that the cost, particularly the cost of purchase supplement, is higher than what we would have targeted. So we were looking at sort of systems that would be running at that stage at around 800 kilos thereabouts per cow fed of concentrate. That pushed closer to 1200. So if there's work to be done, and there's one thing that is significantly off out of kilter, let's say, um, we're feeding about I'd say we're feeding about 300 to 350 kilos of concentrate more than what the roadmap would have said. So it's back to that extra. There's a kilo per cow per day somewhere in the system that needs to come out while actually maintaining or improving herd productivity. That's the one that's a bit out, I would say.
And I suppose the biggest lever in that one, and improving that one, is the whole grass utilization piece, and it's a
Yeah.
big driver. I see there an increase from pasture utilized currently at 7.8 ton per hectare. Trying to get that up to a long term target in that kind of 10 or 11 ton category. Um, why, I suppose, what are the issues preventing farmers maybe reaching that 10, 11 tons of grass utilized?
Um, what we see, like, look, we look last year, there was in 25, there was an extra, close to an extra ton grown, which was a strong improvement or a recovery, I would say. Um, and without getting into too much detail, I know John has covered it and it's been covered on other podcasts, but if you go back and look at it, probably a couple of things there is, first of all, soil fertility, the old story there, soil pH, soil fertility, definitely a big one. Without getting into the detail on it, maybe the rates of reseeding have come back. There was a big push on reseeding 16, 17, 18, those years. We probably have eased off too much on that. So reseeding is another one. Um, Maybe has come in the last number of years, maybe a more creeping reliance on concentrate, and an awful lot of discussion about concentrate levels and responses and all that kind of stuff tends to dominate too much, I would say, in terms of conversations we would have with clients, at groups, etc. We need to get the conversation back more towards getting an extra kilo of grass into the cows every day. So those are a few things. So the pasture management on the day to day, week to week, the soil fertility on the longer term, and also I think maybe the reseeding levels just naturally sort of dropped off for a few years, but we've seen good evidence that that might be it might be turning the other way now again, which is very positive.
And Joe, just on that, I also think it's important, like you're saying, grazing management, but
Mm,
also maybe farm cover targets and making sure that
yeah,
people are
yeah,
attaining those targets throughout the year.
sure. And I think it's one thing, James, and we've been speaking about this, that if you look at a lot of pasture-based farms, and those are farms that are at the better end of the grazing management you would expect, we open a lot of profiles every year in the middle of the season, and the intakes are in at 15 and 3 all season.
Mm.
And there's 3 kilos of concentrate hardwired in for the whole summer. And we have to dig into that more, I would say, Emer. Why are we sort of assuming before we even do anything that 3 kilos is the standard level of concentrate intake, and then maybe pasture intake suffering as a result of that, possibly. So there's a lot of day-to-day management issues there for sure. But it's one thing we have to keep coming back to, is that extra anything we've looked at before, and we're probably tired of saying it at this stage, the difference between top and bottom from a profit point of view. A lot of the time it comes down to cows are eating an extra kilo and a bit of grass every day of the year, kind of a thing. And that's the main driver of the difference, really. So our roadmap targets, James, line up with that.
Yeah, and it's really boiling down from what both of are saying there is it's opportunities to get more grass into our cows, to get more grass utilized per hectare, and that really is going to drive performance. The one thing I would say with that regard, and looking back at some of the old roadmaps, Joe, has progress plateaued? It's probably one of the things where if you look back to 2011, 2012, 7.3 ton of forage utilized per hectare, that's up to 7.8. There was a target there of 2020 for 10 ton. So some people may say, if take, we'll say Emer's example early on in terms of there's additional nitrogen has been taken out of the system over that period, but has that had a negative effect in terms of the amount of pasture that we're actually growing, Joe?
I would say there's evidence there that, yeah, that there was an overcorrection maybe in a very high cost year for fertilizer, James, and it never went back in again, um to the level where it was required. Like, people were maybe going below their allowances. And that certainly, what you would say, has an effect. It's not all of the effect. I think when we looked recently and broke that down, there's maybe 4 ton of a difference top to bottom, and probably half a ton, maybe less, 20, maybe 20% of the total is down to nitrogen. There's probably another 20% down to grazing management, as Emer said. There's probably and the remainder then is split between soil fertility and grazing management. So certainly the nitrogen story is a part of it, but it's not the entire story. But I think we have to be fair too to owner operators out there, James. There's been so many things thrown at farmers in the last couple of years, from a policy point of view, legislation, change in regulations, change in allowances, the direct cost per ton of fertilizer as well. An awful lot of things that were like dairy farmers' heads from it, all that question. Their heads have been spinning for the last number of years on these things. We'd hope to get back, and I think it was evidence of it last year, and we need to carry that into this year with a lower milk price year. People are getting their heads around this a bit better and getting back to maybe farming to the targets a little bit more again, which is needed. And I think we saw the response to that last year. I know there was weather was in our favour, but there was an extra ton or more grown, and farmers felt that they felt it in their pockets. They'll feel it in the feed budget this year when they have a reserve of silage in place. So it proves it was the right thing to be doing, to go back to the basics, really.
Mm.
We just need more of that. But like, we have to keep that in mind. Look at all the changes that have happened, and I was speaking to a group recently from the UK, actually, just last week, and describing what has happened over the last couple of years in terms of what the Irish farmers have been changing and doing. And let's just put it there was a bit of sympathy for the farmers in Ireland on the basis of that, because there's a lot to be thought about, let's say. So I think we need to double down now on the target and get back to really chasing that.
You mentioned it, Joe. It's probably this idea of reducing nitrogen inputs in the absence of clover. Clover's obviously going to have a major role to play in terms of ensuring that we hit our pasture grown and utilized targets, and just pulling nitrogen out of the system in the absence will have a negative impact.
Well, sure, I think it's pretty obvious that there's a fairly linear response to nitrogen. we need clover to replace it. It's a replacement strategy, really, isn't it? That's what it's there to do, is to keep nitrogen in for optimal growth. If we reduce nitrogen fertilizer, but in the absence of clover being in place, and clover is a struggle, James. There's no point in saying otherwise. It's another management step that have to be taken. We're going to lose production, and I suppose asking like Emer at this stage, if we look at the total amount of grassland trials and grassland farmlet studies going on in Moorepark and Teagasc as a whole, there's a very significant proportion of those had been under clover type studies. But am I right in thinking that nearly at this point we're nearly moving on to the point that grass clover swords are becoming the standard
At the norm.
sword now at this
Yeah.
stage?
Yeah, like all our swords will contain clover. And I guess that's the important point. Like you can say that there's clover in your sword, but to reduce
Yeah.
your nitrogen, you need to have a sufficient amount of clover in your sword. It's not just a case of having a low level. So, and as you said, it does take a bit of management, but the benefits are there to be reaped from it.
Yeah, and maybe Emer, when we are talking about that and having a conversation, the protected urea and protected urea usage, I see there's a target to increase it from 35% the whole way up to maybe 85% of total chemical N inputs. Why is it such an important mitigation measure, I suppose, and is that 85% target realistic?
So I guess if we deal with why is protected urea key mitigation measure first. So your protected urea will directly reduce the nitrogen loss to the environment, and that results then in less nitrogen being volatilized into the air, which reduces air pollution and the loss of valuable fertilizer nitrogen, leading to basically improved efficiency. It'll also reduce nitrate leaching because by slowing urea conversion, nitrogen is available then to other plants over a longer period. And grass can then take up more nitrogen, which leaves less in the soil to leach into groundwater as nitrate, and then that helps protect water quality. And protected urea will also reduce nitrous oxide emissions. Now, is 85% uptake realistic? It should be. There's good buy-in, and I guess the research shows that there's no difference in grass production when we use protected urea. In some cases, the grass production has even been better.
Yeah, and Joe, you would say like we're at a stage here where a third of the chemical N inputs are going in now as protected urea. So there definitely is buy-in at commercial farm level, albeit I suppose there've been a few bumps or issues along the way. But have you comments for farmers or listeners with regard? It's an important measure within the roadmap.
Very, very important measure, James. I mean, we're looking for we have to get wins on the environmental side as well. We've been doing a lot in that space, or farmers have. Um, Protected urea probably, obviously, primarily more as a greenhouse gas, but maybe with some as a greenhouse gas mitigation technology. But as Emer mentioned, you do have your nitrogen efficiency benefits as well. But you know, but it has to work for farmers, doesn't it? It has to work and it has to grow grass. And I suppose there's no point in saying it. There were the concerns that were raised and were addressed, I would say, in terms of the product itself and the spreadability. A lot of work done on that over the last year across the whole industry. We heard relatively little last year about that issue. I think we had good grass growing season anyway, so I think it's always tricky when you're bringing in a new technology. Maybe that if there's maybe a year where there's a bit more drought around the place, it maybe the product gets some of the blame for that. Let's say that there was a bit of that as well, but there was no denying there was some issues in terms of certain batches and certain products. But that has kind of settled down, and we haven't heard much really. In addition to that, from the last year, it has settled down, I would say. So look at again similar maybe to what we've talked about as clover. Over time, James, I think protected urea is going to be just become. We won't be talking about nitrogen on the basis of talking about protected urea. We'll just be calling it chemical N, and it'll become sort of like what you might consider a standard product. There's always going to be that bedding down, and those teething issues will happen. But you can't just walk away from it because of that. You fix the problem and you move on, which I think will happen. Same with low emission slurry spreading for the most part. And similar, like we had the very same thing 25 years ago, James, when EBI came in. It didn't do this, it didn't do that, it didn't do the next thing. It was going to breed the milk out of cows, it was going to cause this, going to cause that. Actually, what you can see from the roadmap, back to the roadmap, what we've seen is it promised extra protein and fat, it delivered it. It promised extra fertility, it delivered it. It promised better longevity in the cows, it delivered it. So I think we need to keep the faith in some of these things. There's good technologies coming in underneath. There'll always be that bedding down phase. I think protected urea is at or coming through that phase now. But it's going to become just an embedded technology over the next number of years.
And
Um,
Joe, I think you make a good point there that if people are hesitant about any of the technologies, it's
mm,
really good to ask questions and go
sure.
like seek out results. Even go to a farmer who's using protected urea or who's using another
Yeah.
technology and see how they're getting on, and take that as evidence that you can bring back to your own farm, and put it in place then.
One of the more straightforward things to implement is the switch to protected urea. The problem, like the issue that Emer mentioned around clover and getting clover onto it's tricky to get your head around it, maybe compared to the how much simpler it was to rely on ryegrass plus nitrogen out of the bag. But it's a big challenge for farmers. There's no denying that, and it's not a it needs a lot of work and a lot of management on a day-to-day basis, basically, which is going to make it, you know, a challenge to implement. But we see a lot of farms getting a lot of progress on it in the last couple of years.
So what you're really saying, Joe, is the protected urea, that technology is there, it's available, it has a significant impact, as we say, in terms of from a mitigation point of view. The clover thing is a thing that has to be built on and built on over a long number of years. So farmers need to be using that ready-made technology, and they are a
Yeah,
third of all
I think
chemical
so.
in, as we said.
Yeah.
So it's there and it's ready to go. Emer, um a couple other KPIs there, and maybe ones that farmers aren't as definitely in previous roadmaps maybe weren't as aware of them. But we'll say if we look at from a greenhouse gas emissions intensity point of view, maybe firstly, why focus on emissions per kilo of milk rather than absolute emissions?
Yeah, sure. And I guess this is maybe one of the changes. So Ireland is an export-based country, so any low carbon products per kilo of milk, that's important for access to high value markets and for our overall sustainability. So by measuring emissions per unit rather than absolute emissions, so if we're looking, per kilo of milk, it gives us a measure of the efficiency, and that enables basically a fair comparison. So it allows us compare different farms, so small farms versus large farms, or different production systems like a pasture based versus a confinement, but it also allows us to compare between countries. And the absolute emissions don't allow for this because production volumes vary widely. So, like if, for example, if we had a farm, if a farm was to improve its feed efficiency, its genetics, or its manure management, the emissions per kilo of milk often decreases, even if the total production increases slightly. So to put that into context, then, as the global population continues to grow and demand for dairy rises, the key sustainability question would then be, how can we produce the necessary food for the lowest possible emissions per unit? So I guess that's why we've moved to looking at it as emissions per kilo of milk rather than absolute emissions.
And Ireland's obviously in a very positive when you look at a global scale in a very positive place with that regard. I see a target there of 0.74 kilos of carbon per kilo of fat and protein corrected milk. Um, where did that figure, I suppose, originate?
So I guess it's a pretty low figure, but I think if we were to take all of the targets that are within the roadmap, the 0.74 is used from those that target system and implementing all the parameters in the roadmap. So like your fertility, your concentrate, and anything that's on that would give us that 0.74 figure.
So really, the technologies that are there, if they're implemented, that's where farmers are going to find themselves at.
Yeah, exactly. So the biggest contributors to achieving the reduction would be improving mill solids production, fertility, and reduced reliance on concentrate feed and fertilizer.
It's a lot of things, Joe, that we already spoke about. Maybe it's going to happen and it's going to be reduced by default in terms of engaging in those technologies. Some of them which have been there long term, Joe, and some of them which are obviously relatively new.
Yeah, and that's the thing that it's an efficiency measure, really, isn't it? As Emer outlined there, it's actually an efficiency measure. So what is the underlying basis of it is can you produce milk solids with less of a reliance on fossil fuels, less of a reliance on more days empty or more a higher replacement rate and all those things. So really, when you strip it back, James, you're down to having as much milk produced from um, raised forage as possible, and having the animals in production for as many days in their productive life as possible, and minimizing the inputs in terms of whatever is required to drive, for fossil fuels basically to produce your product. So when you look at that, that tells you that it should help with cost as well as the environmental side. So it's actually a very much
Win-win.
it's a win-win. And I mean, you look at other, I mentioned
Another one,
speaking to,
yeah.
speaking to from farmers from other countries. Like, I mean, one of the things that other countries are talking about is, grazing systems to be more environmentally sustainable. But the issue is that maybe the skill set in a lot of other countries might have been lost at this point around grazing management. We have it. We can do more on it, so we shouldn't lose it. So I think it's a very good news story for the industry as a whole. When we compare internationally, we have a grass-based product, and we have to really live to that.
One I want to touch on before we wrap up is the area around labor and labor inputs. And Joe, how important is labor efficiency, I suppose, to making the dairy sector a nice place to work, to making it an attractive place for the next generation? Um, there's targets within the roadmap, um, obviously to reduce the hours per cow from 35 to 30 hours, but maybe even what does that figure mean to commercial farmers? Just comment around the labour piece.
Yeah, and it's again maybe similar to what we talked about in the emissions, James. There's an efficiency measure there, but there's also an absolute measure needed. So we talk about hours per cow. It's a figure that is useful when we're comparing, say, the efficiency, but then we also have to look at the structure of those hours, and the hours per week for the individual working, for example. Not only for the staff, but also the owner operators as well. So look, roughly speaking, in the roadmap, you're talking about 30 hours per cow. So if you're looking at your standard scale of herd, which is going to be at that stage is going to be around 105 cows, you're talking that's 3,000 hours a year, or 3,200 hours a year to run the dairy farm, basically, which is still 60 hours a week, more or less, right? Now, the issue is when you look at hours per cow, after smaller scale herds will always struggle to have a very low hours per cow figure, because effectively dairy farms are bookended, aren't they, by the requirement to milk twice a day for the most part. So therefore, hours per cow can look quite a poor measure for smaller scale herds. But in that middle ground, even at the scale of 100 to 150 cows, let's say a comparable scale, there's still a big range in the hours per cow. And that's down to maybe calving pattern, it's down to milking times, it's down to fragmentation, possibly down to the use of contractors, down to a lot of reasons. But I'd say calving pattern, milking time, days of grass, fragmentation being the big ones, and the use of contractors, obviously. So it's a good measure maybe to start people off thinking about what's the efficiency on a per cow basis. Then you have to move also to the question of on a per week basis, because you could be, and we do see them, and there's a lot of them out there, really, really efficient per cow, but they are working hours that are very, very long hours in the for the week. Now, that suits some people, of course. It also probably is something that has to be done at certain time. Well, it's definitively has to be done at certain times of the year, but it also might be partly stage of growth or stage of development. People are going to work very, very hard at the start for sure, and then at certain times of the year. But at an industry average or an industry scale, when we come to a settled kind of a farm, what does it look like, or what should it look like from a labour input? And the big things there are, how do we manage to get staff in ways that suits them and that can work to improve the improve the performance of the farm. It's a big area, James. I think maybe it's probably down to the scale of operation that we've been operating on. More and more farms are into the point of having to employ labour and getting on very well with it. Other people may be struggling with that transition. But as a starting point, 30 hours per cow for your average scale herd runs into something like 3,000 hours or about 60 hours a week. Then it becomes a question of how is that 60 hours a week um, designated out, managed, and in time, is it feasible to be reduced?
If we're sitting here in 2030, I suppose, what will define success?
I guess for me, it's improved efficiency, and that can come in many different forms. But it ultimately, gets you, like, we have improved efficiency, like we saw, with the greenhouse gases, or with your surplus nitrogen, or anything like that. That it ultimately will improve your profitability, but it will help the environment. That we're looking at, I guess, improved figures that farmers can have done their best over the next 5 years or so, to improve the efficiency and the output of their business.
Yeah.
Which KPIs then, Joe, maybe within that, which are the ones, I suppose, that maybe give you the most confidence, and which are the ones that you think maybe as an industry we need to try a little bit harder on?
Well, I don't think there's anyone not trying on any of them, James, but I think maybe the couple of things here, right? Um, in my view, anyway, the breeding one, there's such technology and such information on breeding. I think maybe one of the things we're starting to see in the last number of years, and it's only in the last few years, a bit more consensus around it, that people are starting to see the benefits of what has happened now through the technology. I think one of the things that you'd like to see there is, in my view, is just more people getting the confidence to move in that direction. So, for example, if we could see in 6 years' time that, sex semen with with high quality beef genetics on the other side of the coin within herds becomes the standard practice. And that we're moving towards kind of 80% calved in 6 weeks, and that becomes the standard practice. And managing the workload at that time of the year becomes the standard practice. That's real progress, isn't it? Like, that's getting everyone on board as far as that goes. I think the ones that we're going to have to really keep an eye on is um, the cost of the feed budget. Um, can we get some better consensus around stocking rate and optimal stocking rate rather than maximum stocking rate? I think the industry has gone through a huge period of growth. Have we worked out yet exactly how to optimize the number of cows on a farm? We probably haven't. We need to align that then with more farms growing more grass. So I think if we and measuring it. So I think, if to summarize that, if you wanted to get to where you'd like to be in 2030, on average, more farmers knowing what they're growing for the year, get an extra ton of grass growth across farms on average, but doing that using clover maybe as much as using nitrogen. Um, Getting the concentrate levels back to maybe closer to where the roadmap target is, but keeping herd productivity moving. Um, and a bit more consensus around, the balance between pasture production, optimizing stocking rate, and keeping the supplement levels under control. That's going to give us the basis for a very profitable system. Then we have to work out our details then after that in terms of the breeding for better beef genetics and managing the labor. But I think if we get that grass, stocking rate, supplement, nitrogen bit right, and settle that down into a bit more consensus, I think everything else will build around that, and can be solved. But there's a bit of still a bit of sorting out in that space, I think we need to do.
But I think if you look into it, like, the document is, it's quite easy to read, and it's broken
Yeah,
down there in a table. And even if we just take, like, that section on the forage concentrates and fertilizer, and if you drilled
yeah,
into it, like, if the current grazing season length is, for example, 256 days, and by 2030 the target is to get to 275. So
mhm.
that's roughly around 4 days per year
Per
that you
year,
need
yeah,
you need to,
yeah,
so if you did 2 extra days in the spring and two in the autumn, and just small incremental changes, that'll help you, like, the amount of pasture that you utilize can also help with the concentrate, reducing the concentrate that you're feeding per cow. So I think just
yeah.
getting the whole the roadmap, breaking it down into kind of bite-sized chunks that you can work on small areas. It doesn't have to be all in one go.
True, but absolutely. But then aligned with that then is the idea that these are the targets we need to be. The first thing that has to happen is to make sure that people know and are happy that an extra 2 days grazing in spring and autumn this year is better, and that we push for that rather than saying, well, I'm going to go in a different direction altogether. So I think absolutely, Emer, the isn't that really what we've seen on breeding over the last 20 years, is that the progress has been incremental, has been in the background, it has been year by year by year, and it has compounded over time. And then it's only when you look back really you see the
I was
progress,
going to
isn't it?
say that, Joe. These changes and these improvements nearly, and I suppose this is a good process even for ourselves, when you look back over that 10, 15-year period, to think, where you were at and where the industry has come from. And no doubt we'll look forward in the next 10 or 15 years. We'll have a chat. Will we book you in now for that, guys, actually?
I'll be retired at that stage, James.
You're not that old, Joe. But it's good, and it's a good process, and it's something maybe that individual farms can take from the document as well for their own situation. So I think that's a good place to finish, guys. I want to thank you, Emer and Joe, for your time and taking the time with me to maybe have a look and have an in-depth look at some of those KPIs and how maybe farmers might be fit to use them in their own setting. So thanks a million, guys.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You should find more information on the Teagasc Dairy Roadmap on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm James Dunne, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.